In the early spring morning of March, the sun shone brightly, the peach blossoms were in full bloom, and the willows were lush green, making it a time that lifted people's spirits. Emily, however, despised this bright sunshine. She could only suppress her sobs, keeping them tightly sealed behind her lips. James was originally Sarah's fiancé, but due to a night spent with Emily after a bout of drinking, which was captured by the media, he had no choice but to marry her. Sarah was originally an adopted daughter of the Chen family, yet somehow, the two bore a striking resemblance to each other, except for a vermilion mole at the corner of Sarah's eye. That night, James had mistaken Emily for Sarah, simply because Emily had drawn a vermilion mole at the corner of her eye. Emily's life changed entirely because of that mole. After finding out, Sarah left and was never heard from again. And Emily became Mrs. Smith, James's enemy. Emily dug her nails into the mole she had just drawn on. James always demanded she draw that mole, only to have her wipe it off after their moments of intimacy. She knew all too well that he was reminiscing about Sarah and deliberately humiliating her. But that night, it was Sarah who had whimsically insisted that Emily pretend to be her. The two sisters had always been close, often playing pranks by swapping identities to fool their classmates, teachers, and even their parents. Although they had grown apart, especially after both fell in love with the same man, and had stopped such antics, that night, Sarah had had a bit to drink and, reminiscing about their childhood, had coaxed Emily into pretending to be her once more. Emily hadn't thought much of it. What happened afterward was a blur of disjointed fragments in her memory, indistinguishable between reality and illusion, leaving her unable to defend herself. All she knew was that she woke up next to James, with the telltale signs of intimacy all over her body. Under the pressure of her parents and the overwhelming media coverage, James married her. Sarah never questioned anyone and quietly left. It seemed like her family had conspired to bully the adopted daughter. Emily laughed through her tears at the reflection in the mirror.
Sarah, you are ruthless.
But there was someone even more ruthless than her. Emily was taken to the hospital, where she saw James with a stern expression.
Remove it.
There was no need to ask, Emily knew he was referring to the mole she had recently added.
Mr. Smith, this mole was artificially created. Removing it so soon could damage the skin.
James glanced at the clock on the wall.
You have 20 minutes.
The doctor looked at Emily's fair skin, feeling a pang of pity for such a beautiful face.
It might leave a scar.
Get another doctor.
James didn't look at him, giving instructions to the bodyguard beside him. Emily had been silent since she was brought in, watching coldly as if it had nothing to do with her. Finally, she slowly covered the corner of her eye with her hand.
James, didn't you say that no matter what, I would never be Sarah? So why do you care about this little mole? What's the difference if it's there or not? Or are you afraid you'll forget her and only remember me?
James turned his gaze to her, looked for a moment, then looked away. He said nothing, but Emily saw the disdain in his eyes. He didn't think she was worth a second glance, nor did he think it was worth explaining anything. This mole belonged to Sarah, and having it on her face was an insult to Sarah. Emily turned to the new doctor.
I don't need anesthesia.
The intense pain of the laser burning her skin made Emily bite her lip hard. The smell of burnt flesh made her feel nauseous. When she came out of the treatment room, she pointed to the small bloody pit on her face with a smile.
Satisfied?
James glanced at her, his cold eyes confirming that the procedure had gone smoothly. Satisfied with the result, he got up and left. From beginning to end, he didn't say a word to her. Emily returned home, looking at her disfigured face in the mirror. She laughed, and as she laughed, tears began to flow.
Tell Emily to come down.
James's voice came from downstairs. Then there were the footsteps of the servants. Emily followed the servant downstairs in silence.
Didn't you see everything at the hospital? Are you still not reassured?
My mother is coming.
James frowned at her. Emily pointed to her face with a smile.
So, what should I tell her?
What right do you have to negotiate with me? His disdain was evident. This morning, your father took a $20 million project from me.
Emily was speechless.
Emily, you and your parents are disgusting, he sneered coldly. But people like you are born actors. Keep up the act.
When James first met Sarah, no one knew his true identity. Shortly after his identity was revealed, Emily disguised herself as Sarah and had a relationship with him. At that time, James's company was in crisis, and its stock had already taken a severe hit, unable to withstand any more turmoil. It seemed like Emily and her parents had timed it perfectly to deceive him and drive Sarah away. Despite James's hatred for her, his mother, Helen, was the only one in the family who treated Emily well. Although Emily spoke harshly, she couldn't bear to upset Helen, who was a patient. Years ago, after James's father passed away suddenly, the Smith family was thrown into chaos with everyone vying for power. Although James eventually took control, Helen's mental state deteriorated, possibly due to the sudden loss or the ugly power struggles. Over the years, James had sought the best psychiatrists for her, but with little success. Fortunately, Helen, despite her fluctuating mental clarity, had always been kind to Emily. So, when Emily heard she was coming, she was genuinely happy and didn't want to cause her any distress. As for the injury on her face, she planned to say it was an accident. Emily instructed the servants to prepare dinner, remembering James and Helen's dietary preferences and restrictions. Initially, she did this to please them, but it had become a habit. After making all the arrangements, she heard a car pull up outside and went to greet Helen. James was already standing on the porch, always respectful and dutiful to his mother. Emily adjusted her expression and linked her arm with James's, leaning slightly towards him. Only in Helen's presence did he not reject her proximity, even if it was just an act. As expected, James glanced at her hand but didn't stop her, allowing her to walk with him to the car and open the door.
Who are you? Helen's smile froze as she stepped out of the car, frowning at Emily.
Emily's smile turned to shock, and she glanced worriedly at James. Was Helen's condition worsening? Why hadn't he mentioned it? James ignored her, his body tense and eyes fixed on the car. Emily felt a strange sensation and followed his gaze. Helen was blocking the car door, but Emily could see someone else inside.
Sarah, come out, she called softly.
Emily felt like she had been struck by lightning. James abruptly let go of Emily's hand, his tall frame leaning forward, trembling slightly. The person in the car seemed oblivious to the anticipation outside, slowly getting out from the other side. She wore a pale yellow dress, her thin, pale face marked by a striking red mole, leaving everyone stunned.
James.
James, as if waking from a dream, strode over and enveloped her in a tight embrace. Emily tried to stay rooted to the spot, but she saw Sarah, with her face buried in James's chest, turn and give her a strange smile.
Sister, I'm back.
Standing in Emily's house, Sarah looked at her with a pleading smile. Emily was suddenly taken back to their childhood memories. When Sarah was brought home from the orphanage, she had the same cautious smile, her anxious eyes betraying her unease. A soft sister had instantly melted Emily's heart, making her accept this younger sister from the bottom of her heart. But now, Emily clenched her fists and looked at her warily.
Why are you back?
Sarah had disappeared without a word after what happened back then. Now she suddenly returned, and it couldn't be that simple. Sure enough, the next second, Sarah suddenly knelt in front of her.
Sister, please help me. I have a severe illness and need a bone marrow transplant.
Emily was stunned for a long time before she slowly said,
We are not related by blood. I can't help you.
No. Sister. Before you got married, I heard you and Mom talking. You knew I was Dad's other daughter. You knew. We are half-sisters. Sister, I'm begging you, please get tested for a match. I don't want to leave this world. Even if I have nothing left, Even if I give everything to you, I still want to live. Even if it's just to watch you live well from afar.
She finished the sentence while looking at James. James, recovering from his shock, pulled her up from the ground.
You have an illness?
Yes, if I weren't desperate, I wouldn't come back to trouble you.
So patient, so helpless. So guilt-inducing and pitiable.
Sarah, tell me, what exactly happened that night? Why did you suddenly want to play the identity swap game? And what happened afterward?
Sister, what are you talking about? When did I ever ask for that?
Sarah, don't play innocent. You're asking me to save your life, and I can't even get the truth?
Sister.
Enough! James interrupted them. I'll arrange for the hospital and the matching test immediately.
If you want to get tested, do it yourself.
James gave her a cold look, ignoring her protest, and turned to ask Sarah about her condition with concern.
Sarah, you're faking your illness.
No, I have my medical records here, sister. I'll show you.
Emily waved her hand, scattering the medical records on the floor. Sarah suddenly screamed and fell backward. James, standing right behind her, naturally wouldn't let her fall. He caught her steadily but took the opportunity to push Emily back. Emily looked at him in shock as she stumbled back, crashing into the dining table and knocking over several dishes, falling to the ground. James didn't even glance at her, carrying the fainted Sarah out, with Helen following closely behind. Soup dripped onto her body, and broken porcelain pieces pierced her palms. Emily finally couldn't hold back and cried out loud on the floor.
Ma'am, Mr. James said to take you to the hospital too.
The servant's voice brought a warmth to Emily's heart. After all, she had lived with James for so long, there had to be some affection between them, right?
No need, it's just a minor injury. Bring the first aid kit, and I'll handle it myself.
Emily didn't want to face Sarah again so soon. Her sudden return had thrown her off balance, and she needed to calm down first.
But Mr. James said you must go today, to get tested immediately.
Emily was stunned. Just a moment ago, they said it would be a few days, but now, with Sarah fainting, they couldn't wait any longer. Seeing her standing still, the bodyguards at the door exchanged glances and walked towards her.
No need to drag me.
Emily glared at them and walked towards the car. She knew very well that if James had given the order, there was no way she could avoid going to the hospital today. Once at the hospital, no one paid attention to her bleeding wound. She was immediately taken for a blood test to check for compatibility. As the large needle pierced her vein, Emily's stomach churned, and she doubled over, dry heaving.
Are you pregnant? If so, there's no need for the test. Even if you're a match, you can't donate bone marrow.
Then terminate it.
James!
Emily looked up in disbelief at the man who had rushed in. James didn't even glance at her, only telling the doctor.
That's not an issue. Just proceed with the compatibility test.
His cold tone made it seem like he wasn't talking about a life, as if it had nothing to do with him.
James, if I'm pregnant, it's your child. How can you be so heartless?
James finally looked at her.
You're not worthy.
Not worthy of carrying his child, which was why he always gave her contraceptives. Even if she got pregnant by accident, it had to be terminated.
You look down on me so much, yet you don't think my lowly blood is unworthy of saving Sarah?
James scoffed, not bothering to argue with her, and turned to check on Sarah. The most heartbreaking thing wasn't the argument, it was being completely ignored. How ironic that they were now waiting for her to save a life. In the following days, Emily's parents also received the news and took turns persuading her. Since she couldn't resist, they suggested she donate the bone marrow willingly. As for the child, it was unfortunate, but there would be other opportunities in the future. After all, she was now Mrs. Smith. Emily neither accepted nor refuted their pleas, her entire being seemed drained of life, like a walking corpse. Until the compatibility results came out, proving the prediction true. She wasn't pregnant, but she also couldn't save Sarah.
This is fate, or perhaps, karma.
Emily said, glancing at the test results before tossing them to the ground. Sarah broke down in tears. She didn't wail, just silently cried, looking utterly helpless and desperate. James comforted her gently, then turned to Emily with a cold gaze.
Cord blood.
Cord blood? Emily froze for a moment, then realized what he meant, her body trembling. Sarah, seeing a glimmer of hope after her despair, smiled briefly before putting on a sorrowful expression.
What if it still doesn't work? I might not have much time left.
I asked the doctor. At 4 months pregnant, we can test the amniotic fluid for compatibility. If it doesn't match, we'll terminate it. Don't worry.
This.
Sarah looked at Emily with a troubled expression, but couldn't hide the joy in her eyes.
James! I refuse. I'd rather die than agree.
I'll take you home first.
Ignoring her protests, James gently patted Sarah's hair.
You've been out for a while. You need to rest.
Watching James protectively lead Sarah away, treating her like a precious treasure, Emily felt a sharp pain in her heart. She rushed in front of them, spreading her arms to block their path.
Sarah, listen to me. I won't help you. I won't sacrifice my own child for you. Unless you explain to James right now what really happened that night.
Emily's eyes were red, her demeanor desperate.
Sister, what night are you talking about?
Stop pretending. Tell him who suggested we switch identities that night.
Sister, it was me. She's right. It was my idea that night.
James looked at her in disbelief, confusion written all over his face. Emily was also stunned. Why did she admit it so easily?
Because Mom told me that after all these years of raising me, I had to be useful. She said I should either give you up to my sister or spend a night with Mr. Juan to help Dad secure that resort project.
Sarah seemed to struggle to control her emotions, trembling like a leaf in the wind.
I had no choice. I couldn't bear to lose you. This is all karma. I gave you up. I gave up our relationship. That's why I got this illness. You don't have to care about me anymore. Just live a good life with my sister.
Enough.
Sarah's sobs immediately quieted into suppressed whimpers. Emily watched as James's icy gaze bore into her, her heart sinking.
Get out of the way.
James kicked Emily hard in the ribs, sending her sprawling to the side. Without a glance at her, he left with Sarah. Sarah's heel ground into Emily's fingers before she finally walked away. Emily was confined. James, who previously disliked having too many people around, now had the villa swarming with staff to ensure Emily couldn't leave. He even assigned a nurse to stay with her. On the first morning, Emily was still resting when she was abruptly awakened by the nurse, who handed her a thermometer with a blank expression. Emily was bewildered.
Measuring basal body temperature to calculate ovulation period.
Emily angrily threw the thermometer to the ground. The nurse glanced at her and took out a new one. Emily refused to take it, and the nurse didn't push her, resulting in a standoff.
Get out!
The nurse remained silent, standing her ground, clearly not leaving without the results. Emily suddenly realized there was no point in making things difficult for her, she was just following James's orders. She took the thermometer, measured her temperature, and handed it back.
Next time, please don't talk or move. I'll wake you up and measure directly for accurate results. The nurse noted her temperature and then took out a test strip. This is an ovulation test strip. Please use it.
Tell James to see me, or I won't cooperate anymore.
Seeing Emily's resolute attitude, the nurse said nothing and left. James arrived quickly, but Emily felt her heart wrapped in a thick layer of ice, making it hard for her to breathe.
Name your terms.
Any terms? I really want to know how much you care about her. To save her life, how far would you go?
More than you can imagine. Someone like you wouldn't understand. What do you want? The entire James Corporation?
She wanted it, he would give it to her. With his abilities, building another empire stronger than the Smiths would only take time.
I want the James Corporation.
Done.
He agreed so readily, his contempt evident. Emily's heart was numb with pain, but she forced a smile.
Not just that. I want you too. I want you, after I save Sarah, to never see her again, never contact her, never mention her to anyone. You have to treat me the way you treated her.
James's face changed, but before he could scold her, Emily continued.
I know you can't do that in your heart. But it's okay, I just need you to do it on the surface.
James hadn't expected her to make such a demand. He could refuse, but looking at Emily's calm expression and the madness in her dark eyes, he nodded. Emily hadn't expected James to agree so quickly, nor had she expected her body to have issues. The test results showed that her ovulation was abnormal, but the doctors couldn't find a pathological reason, attributing it to psychological factors and advising her to relax and let things happen naturally.
We want to have a child as soon as possible. Please prescribe some ovulation-stimulating medication. If that doesn't work, we'll consider other options, even artificial insemination. I want to get pregnant quickly.
But Mrs. Smith, your current health is normal. Using medication might have side effects. It's better to adjust your mindset and conceive naturally.
My husband is eager for a child. To fulfill his wish, I'm willing to do more.
Her warm face pressed against James's tense body, her eyes filled with affection.
Mr. and Mrs. Smith, your deep affection is truly enviable.
Emily began receiving ovulation-stimulating injections, with James always by her side. When Sarah appeared, James was helping Emily off the injection table. Feeling dizzy from lying down too long, Emily leaned weakly against him. Seeing Sarah's pale face at the door, James instinctively wanted to let go.
James, don't forget our agreement.
That can wait until you save Sarah first.
James pushed her away, letting her fall to the ground, and ran after Sarah. The cold floor and harsh lights couldn't compare to the desolation in Emily's smile. She sat for a moment, then got up, composed herself, and walked out, sending James a text.
I'll be waiting in the car. If I don't see you in 10 minutes, the agreement is off.
In less than 5 minutes, a furious James opened the car door and ordered the driver to start the car.
Take Mrs. Smith home first, then take me to the office.
When Emily got out of the car, she blew a kiss to the people inside, smiling as the car sped away, tears streaming down her face. When Sarah asked to meet her, Emily wasn't surprised at all. Seeing Sarah's pale face and dark circles under her eyes, Emily glanced at the coffee in front of her and called the waiter.
Waiter, could you please bring a glass of warm water?
She provocatively looked at Sarah, who clenched her fists in response.
So what? He cares about your health and your child only to help me.
That's right. But did he tell you what he has to give up for me to help you?
Sarah pressed her lips together, saying nothing.
It seems you don't know. Now, the entire James Corporation is mine, and James is just managing this wealth for me. Of course, he also has to create more wealth for me.
She blew the tiny bug off her fingertip.
And he promised me that after the surgery, he would never see you again and would spend the rest of his life lovingly with me.
Sarah abruptly stood up, knocking over the coffee pot. The stain spread on her clothes, but she didn't care.
Emily! How could you do this?
Why couldn't I? Don't forget, he was my husband in the first place. If you really love him that much, then don't accept my child's help to save you. But if you leave, James and I will still grow old together.
Sarah staggered, and Emily gracefully stood up and left. To her surprise, Sarah behaved exceptionally well afterward. She didn't cause any more trouble or pester James. And Emily herself successfully became pregnant. The early pregnancy discomforts hit her hard, with severe nausea making it impossible to even drink water, relying entirely on 4 fluids. James kept his promise and stayed by her side. Emily often felt that after helping Sarah, she and James might also have a chance to start anew. When she was 4 months pregnant, the doctor performed an amniocentesis for matching. As if answering everyone's prayers, the matching results were ideal. The umbilical cord blood from the baby in her womb could indeed help Sarah. Emily, however, didn't feel any better. All the pregnancy symptoms seemed to concentrate on her, leaving her with no energy to think about anything else. She somehow endured to the late stages of pregnancy. 2 months later, the baby was born smoothly, Sarah was helped, and James surprisingly kept his promise, never seeing Sarah again. But for Emily, this was far from enough. After her confinement period, she immediately sold all the shares of James Corporation and filed for divorce.